Good morning for those of you guys joining us from New Haven or the East Coast. Good evening for those of you joining us from Asia, and I suppose it's possible that you're joining us from somewhere else. So hello to the rest of you as well. My name is Devin Lau. I'm the Associate Director for Yale Center Beijing, and I am hosting our talk today. We're very excited to welcome back Denise Lady. She is the Ruth and Bruce Dayton Curator of Asian Art at the Yale University Art Gallery. She's a graduate of Columbia, but she's also served as the Brooke Russell Astor Curator of Asian Art Emerita at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, as well as in curatorial positions at the Asia Society in New York and the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. She's endlessly fascinated by the development and movement of technologies, ideas, and images within and between Asian cultures, and between these centers and those in Africa, Europe, and the Americas. In addition to curating exhibitions, she's also published and lectured widely, exploring topics including Buddhist art, Chinese and Asian ceramics, as well as East Asian lacquer. She's published many articles and books spanning a lot of different topics. Her most recent book, of course, being Celadon on the Seas, Chinese Ceramics, from the 9th to the 14th century, which she also was kind enough to give a talk on as well a few months ago. And so we're happy to welcome her back to talk about her latest interests and her latest research, and that's about white clay, Chinese ceramics, and Eurasian exchanges. And so with that, I will turn things over to her.
Thank you, everyone, for coming, especially those of you that are up early in the morning, including me. So something fascinating happened in China in the late 6th century, which is that they changed the kind of clay they were using, and they went from sort of a low-fired red clay to a high-fired white clay. And this had a profound impact on ceramics in West Asia and in the Eastern Mediterranean. And so the story I'm kind of working on developing is, I think of it more as like waves going back and forth rather than things going in a straight line. And it is a complicated story with a lot of side avenues. So I'm going to give you an overview of this story, and then I'm going to give you two byways and one epilogue, so that I can get most of the ideas in, even though I can't get them in quite in a straight line. So the first question we need to answer is why? Why did people change the type of clay that they were using? Now, most of our information about ceramics from this point in time comes from two sources. One is archaeology, because there so much, as many as I suspect all of you know, has been excavated in China in the last 30 years. And the other is the development of non-invasive testing of materials, which is something that has happened in museums around the world, including in Shanghai, for example, where we are able now, without taking a sample out of an object, to really understand how it was made. So we know that the white clay that popped up mysteriously has a high percentage of a material called, in English, kaolin, and in Chinese, gaoling, and it's basically the primary ingredient in porcelain. So one of the reasons for beginning to choose this clay clearly was that it was a more plastic clay, it was a finer clay, and it could be high fired. It's also true that when you look through tombs from the last quarter of the 6th century, which is when we begin to see white clay, a large number of tombs featuring white clay, but not all of them, it becomes clear that there seems to have been some kind of taste or choice on the part of the tomb inhabitant for this material. So I'm showing you three things from the tomb of Zhang Sheng, who died in 595. And in that tomb, you find tomb figures and containers, the kinds of things that you would find in almost any tomb. You also find objects such as this chessboard that are very, very much reflective of his taste and the kinds of things that he felt he needed in his afterlife. And there are a significant number of objects in this tomb which really suggests that he was aware of a broader world and very interested in things from other places. Probably the best example of this is this ewer, which I'm showing you on the left at the moment, which has an elephant spout, a dragon handle, and these very, I suspect, non-functional lugs decorating the shoulders or the neck of the ewer. This is unusual in Chinese ceramic history for many, many reasons. First of all, it's a one-off. It's unique. I have been unable, and I have looked, to find anything else that looks like this anywhere in China from the same point in time. I've also been unable to find it elsewhere. The closest parallel I can find is the bronze pouring vessel, which I'm showing you on the right, which also has an elephant spout and more or less the same bulbous shape. That vessel is generally cataloged as Vietnamese and dates to the 2nd or 3rd century AD. So it's several hundred years earlier than the piece in the tomb that we're looking at. I have no answer for this. It's just something I don't understand, because either the bronze vessel is something that was found in South China and preserved in Vietnam, which is possible because in the Han Dynasty, Vietnam was under Chinese rule, or there were more of these things kicking around and he had seen one somewhere and wanted to preserve them, or I don't understand this story at all. Any of those options are possible. You also find in his tomb these delicate little trays with round feet. This is a new shape in Chinese ceramics. It is definitely a shape that was introduced from outside. It probably comes from either Sogdia or from the Sasanians, so it's from the greater West Asian world. It is something that is closer in time to the late 6th century in China, and it is the type of thing that is found repeatedly in Chinese ceramics and metalwork from the 6th to the 8th century, often accompanied by small cups, probably for serving wine, and then a little dish of some sort for serving some kind of a sweet. So if I'm trying to figure out, and I am, why white clay sort of pops up in China, one of the things to do is look for things that might have inspired the taste for white clay. And so I started looking around for more parallels in shapes and designs. And the thing that I can find the most of are these small white cups, which are made from this beautiful, very high-fired white clay in the Sui and the Tang Dynasty, often in sets. They are made primarily in clay, but you also find them in Chinese glass. And interestingly enough, they have prototypes or parallels in what we call Roman glass. Now, that's a bit of a misnomer. Roman glass was one of the great luxuries of the ancient Eurasian world. It was found in Europe. It's found throughout, obviously, the Eastern Mediterranean, but it's also been found in Xinjiang, in China, and in significant quantities in South Korea. And it's possible that this shape was inspired by these imported goods that came in, because both the shape and the white clay sort of pop up in the late 6th century. And an argument for the fact that the Chinese were aware of Roman glass and looking at it is found in the development of sancai about 100 years later than the first use of white clay. Now, sancai, or three-color glazes, as you all know, have three colors: green, amber, and white. The green and the amber are found as early as the Han Dynasty. The white is the new color. So it is the choice of white 100 years earlier that makes it possible to do the three color glazes around 675 AD. So 100 years after the beginning of the use of white clay. And just very, very quickly, and I can do this innumerable times, if you look at the patterning and the surface effects that you find in Roman or West Asian glass, and the surface effects that you find in Chinese sancai, where you can see similarities in streaking, in mosaic-like patterns, and in using clay and glass to actually imitate the surface effects of semi-precious stones. So my theory at the moment is that sancai, which seems to have appeared almost miraculously, like from the head of a god, right? All of a sudden, people have totally changed what they're doing with glazes and they're splashing them, kind of like Jackson Pollock on the surface of clay. That sancai may have been made as a competition initially for Roman glass. So we're going from the 6th to the 7th to the 8th century. White is the through line, and white clay is developing. It's becoming also moving, clay in general is moving away from funerary context and becoming much more part of an elegant lifestyle. So that by the time you get to the Tang Dynasty, people are writing poems about ceramics and they're writing connoisseurship about ceramics. What are the best ceramics? What are the ceramics you should use for drinking tea? What are the ceramics you should use for drinking wine? And by the time you get to our friend Wei Tsung, you can see clearly that white ceramics are part, very, very much part of an elegant lifestyle. They're also developing, so the clay, which is inherently plastic, as I remembered, has allowed people to make thinner and thinner ceramics. It's also allowed people to shape ceramics with points and lobes that you need a very strong clay to make. And so they are a technical, logical marvel in the sort of late ancient or early medieval world. And they are traveling. Ceramics that are being made in northern China, while they are not as ubiquitous as the green glazed wares that are being made in the south, are moving both across the Silk Road, so they're moving overland, and they're also moving by sea. They have been found as far west, again in very, very small numbers, as far west as Egypt and as far east as Japan. And everywhere they go, they're causing a lot of interest. At the same time, sancai, which we think of as a primarily a burial good, is also found in the same context with the same things. And you can go from a piece of Roman glass to a Chinese ceramic with a three-color glaze imitating the shape of a piece of Roman glass, to an Islamic dish imitating the surface effect of a sancai ware. You can also start looking at numerous attempts in the greater West Asian world to imitate the impact of these very, very rare, extremely elegant early Chinese whitewares. And to just give you one example of this, in the 7th and 8th century, there was a ruler, the 5th Abbasid caliph named Harun al-Rashid, who received a gift of 2,000 Chinese ceramics from someone who was obviously trying to establish diplomatic ties with him. 20 of those pieces were Chinese whitewares, which shows how rare and valuable they were in the world at the time. And they spurred the development of a technology in West Asia, which served ultimately to redefine ceramics in the Eastern Mediterranean and Europe. So this is our Chinese piece that we were just looking at. And since I am talking to a Yale crowd, this is my showing off. This is a recent gift from an alumni. It's an example of Xingware. It is on view in the galleries if you want to see it. And if you look at the back of it, you can see that the clay itself, in addition to the glaze, is basically white, and that it's a very, very thin and very strong clay. It's also, not surprisingly, because when you fire a ceramic and the glaze and the clay meld and they vitrify, as it's called, it becomes more hygienic because it's cleaner. The piece that you're looking at on your right is an example of the tin glazing that developed in the ancient world, in an ancient Western Asian world, in an attempt to imitate the appearance of Chinese ceramics. So the clay in this case is not white. It's actually a light buff color, which they've then covered completely with a off-white glaze that has been made thicker and whiter by adding some combination of tin and other elements to the glaze or to the surface covering. And then, of course, they painted it in a splash design in blue and green, which imitates, again, to a certain extent, this taste for white that's developing throughout the Asian world over time and very, very quickly. So the tin glazing was developed in the 8th and the 9th century. In the 9th and the 10th century, Islamic ceramics developed another technology, which is called luster. It developed first in Egypt and then went back into Iran and Iraq. In luster, you cover the ceramic with a tin glaze. You paint the design on it. You cover it with a transparent glaze. You fire it. You then repaint the design on it using metallic oxides, and you fire it again so that it has the surface effect of metal or glass. So this 9th or 10th century Egyptian piece actually shows us a Coptic priest with a censer or an incense burner and an ankh that has been turned into a cross, which is very typical of sort of Coptic imagery. And the Iraqi ceramic shows you a very Sasanian, Sogdian figure. Sort of, it should remind you of the wall painting we saw in the beginning of the talk, where you see a person seated with his legs crossed in front of him, holding vessels and drinking. Generally, the Iranian ones are a little bit yellower looking in their luster than the Egyptian ones. In all cases, these are very, very expensive, highly finished ceramics that have been decorated both on the inside and the outside, and were probably the luxury goods of the time. And so all of this technology, which is developing in Egypt and further off where I don't have a map here, eventually moves into northern Africa and into southern Spain, which, as I'm sure many of you know, had Islamic kingdoms for a very long period of time. And you get tin glaze ceramics developing initially in the Cordoba region and then later in Granada. And this is exactly the same technology that was developed in the West Asian world in imitation of Chinese whiteware. So you have a tin glaze ceramic. It is painted with copper and magnesium. So the primary colorants are green and a kind of a purplish brown. And this is called in Spanish verde y magnesio, vert et brun in French, and something else in Italian. This becomes the European technology from the sort of 9th to the 11th century. As you can see, we have a shared visual language as well. So the bottle has a procession of musicians, and both the plate and the storage jar have inscriptions in them that are actually written in Kufic and in Arabic, which tell us, which offer, they're usually things like they either say kingship or dominion, or they offer wishes for good health. So this entire technology keeps spreading from the south of Spain all the way into other centers in Spain, to a certain extent in southern France, and definitely into Italy. And as the technology evolves, they also begin making lusterware. So just as an aside, I'm showing you a scene from the Alhambra in Granada, which is a 12th century monument, to remind you that in this part of the world, in addition to using ceramics for eating and for ritual vessels and for display, tile making is also a major storyline, and they're making everything the same way. Over time, the Spanish ceramic industry also begins to make lusterware. And that then becomes part of the whole sort of tin glazing story in Europe. The two of the most dramatic examples of this lusterware are what are known as the Alhambra vases. They're known as the Alhambra vases because in the 19th century, some of them were found in the Alhambra. They were also written about by Washington Irving in his tale of the Alhambra. In the 19th century, when they were rediscovered, these became a major storyline in European ceramics and were repeated over and over again. So if you visit European museums, you will see things in this shape. There are 10 vases that are extant today that are known as the Alhambra vases, and there are another handful of fragments in museums around the world that people think were initially part of these vases. The shape itself derives from a very standard storage jar that was found in the Arabic and early Spanish ceramic industries. However, these are so tall, they run between 48 and 55 inches, that the general consensus is that they were intended primarily for display, so that these are not functional vessels. As you can see, they have absolutely gorgeous surfaces with multiple complicated geometric patterns and areas of decoration that tell different things. They also have, for some bizarre reason, these side wings that I can't quite figure out. Very few of them are that stable, so they probably had stands of some sort. This is clearly a later addition. The piece on your left, which is now in the Hermitage Museum in Russia, has two Kufic inscriptions on it, one in the medallions on the upper part of the body and another just below it. Um, the first group of inscriptions basically say pleasure. The second group of inscriptions say health. The jar on your right, which is in the Alhambra, is the most famous of the Alhambra jars. It is called the gazelle jar for the obvious reason that it's decorated with gazelles. Unlike the slightly earlier one that's in the Hermitage, this one is starting to use a great deal of blue, which is a color we'll come back to for our epilogue. The blue is derived from cobalt. Again, beautifully decorated surface, and again, Arabic inscriptions written in the Spanish version of the Kufic script, which basically say good fortune and prosperity over and over and over again. So this technology develops in southern Spain, and then it flows up the Mediterranean coast to multiple Spanish centers, including in Manises, in Valencia, in Barcelona. And all of these centers essentially go through the same technical development that we saw in southern Spain. So you have the green and the blue, purple, or the green and the brown type of ceramic first, and then they begin to paint with the lusterware, and you get these much more complicated surfaces. We can tell from the cross on the mast that this ship is actually probably a Portuguese now, which is a Christian ship, not a Muslim ship. It's shown sailing on the seas with fish underneath, and these little semicircles along the edges can be traced back to Iranian ceramics and glass dating from the 9th to the 10th century. It is painted on a tin glaze with shades of green and brown and cobalt blue, and then glazed again with a luster glaze to make it look more shiny and more metallic. So just to give you a sense of geography, basically this Spanish technology is moving along here, found multiple places in Spain, less in southern France. I spent a lot of time recently visiting small museums, trying to figure out what there was. And then it moves into Italy from both the north and from the south. And one of the major centers for the production of this type of ware is actually Tunis or Tunisia, which, as you can see, is fairly close to Sicily and to Italy itself. So it's kind of moving right along here. And in the late 14th and early 15th century, you have an Italian variant of this ceramic tradition developing. So I'm showing you what's a very fun little, probably drinking vessel that has this delightful little fish painted again, white tin glaze, green and brown colors, and a much more elaborate and slightly later dish, which again was probably intended for display. It's almost 2 feet wide. So that's a little big for daily use. And you can see that it's got these two little holes on the top. And if you look at the back, just to remind you, the clay itself is not the kind of high-fired, beautiful white clay that was coming into the world from China at this time. It's actually a red earthenware. It's low-fired. Earthenware, if you think your basic clay flower pot, that's what earthenware is. And again, it has been made to look like a completely different material by covering it with a tin glaze and then painting it in shades of brown and green. In this case, the story is a very sort of 15th century European story of a courtier riding a horse in a kind of floral background that's not very clear where it's supposed to be. And he's got two letters coming out of his mouth. One is a T and one is an E. And people have speculated that essentially what's going on is that he's saying, I love you, te amo, and this was some kind of a gift from one person to another. Possible, don't know. So just to remind you again, it's moving along the Mediterranean. It's very, very much a Mediterranean story. And we're going to go back to Italy, and we're going to be sort of right underneath Montelupo in Pisa, of Leaning Tower fame. And we're going to talk about one of our byways. So Italy in the 11th to the 14th century was not the Italy we know today, right? It was not a unified nation. It actually became a country after the United States. It was a series of civic and mercantile centers, which were often in competition with each other. One of those centers was Pisa, which became a major mercantile force in European trade, or in Mediterranean trade is probably more accurate, in the 11th century. And as a result, because of all the money that was coming into the city, began to build churches. Now, these Pisan churches, this is, remember, before the tin-glazed Islamic, tin-glazed Italian industry it has really begun to develop. These Pisan churches are fascinating. We're going to look at two 11th century ones, but we could look at 13th and 14th century ones as well, because they did something very unusual. They are by and large made from a yellow limestone that was found in the area. However, they enhanced this yellow limestone by repurposing Roman columns and other marble pieces of Roman architecture, which they called spolia. And then they further enhanced the surface of these ceramics by sticking ceramics, imported ceramics, on the walls in different locations. So just to look very closely, there is still an imported Islamic ceramic in this niche. There is not one here. There is not one here. There is one here. There is not one here. There is not one here. There is not one here. So this church, which by the way was closed clearly when I visited it, and also has Roman architectural things inside apparently, is called San Zeno. It's an early 11th century church. And all of the ceramics that have been found there are thought to have been made in Tunisia. So basically, these are all imported ceramics. And in the early 11th century, most of the ceramics that were found in Italy seem to have been coming in from Morocco and Tunisia, and only to a small extent from southern Spain. By the late 11th century, different church, San Sisto, you're finding more of these ceramic vessels used to decorate the churches themselves, and they're coming from more places. So San Sisto was concentrated in 1087. Again, we've got our yellow limestone, our Roman columns, and for some bizarre reason, these imported ceramics stuck all the way along the upper facade of the church. So you can see, in this case, they seem to have been placed more deliberately. They seem to have been less random, and they're definitely coming from a broader part of the world. So you see them not only along the surface here, but they were originally in all of these niches along the side of the church. You can see that there are still two here. The ceramics in San Sisto come from Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco, and southern Spain. And the question that I've spent most of the summer thinking about is why do this? Obviously, there were ceramics coming up in enough numbers that they were widely available and a church could get their hand on them. And I think by the late 11th century, plan to put these ceramics on the surface. One of the things that people who study this phenomenon, which is known as bacini in Italian, suggest is that it was about polymateriality and wanting to have a kind of different surface effect, so that between the yellow limestone and the white marble and the ceramics that were stuck towards the tops of all the churches, it looked more lively. I have to say, I'm not entirely convinced, but partially that may be because when I was there, it was raining. So they didn't look all that colorful. And if you didn't know that they were there and start to look up for them, it was very difficult to be sure exactly what you were seeing. I don't know that they necessarily catch your eye if you're walking down on ground level, but they did this extensively, particularly in Pisa, from the 11th to the 14th century. And they did it with more and more ceramics imported from more and more parts of the world. So, since the 1970s, they have begun to take these ceramics off these churches and preserve them in a small museum in a convent in Pisa, where they are basically in rooms with early Renaissance paintings. So they have nothing to do with each other. This particular group is all from Sicily. They have studied them. The discovery and rediscovery of these bacini in the Italian churches has helped people learn more about the Tunisian ceramic industry, which is something that we knew nothing about. And over time, Italy becomes the center for these tin-glazed wares, which begin to look very, very different. So if you've heard the term majolica, majolica means a tin-glazed European ceramic, comes from the Islam, technology comes from the Islamic world. The taste for white comes from early China. And the reason that we use the Italian word to discuss this kind of ceramics in European ceramics, as opposed to the Spanish one, is because over time Italy overtook this ceramic industry and became the center for majolica. Although potters today who are studio potters, who are interested in making ceramics as individual works of art rather than as things for distribution, also sometimes revert to tin glazing as an aesthetic choice. So that's our byway number one. Our byway number two has to do with the development of medicine in Eurasia in the 11th, 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries. And one of the things that when we study global trade, we don't always pay attention to is what was traveling with ceramics. So clay, and to a lesser extent textiles, are what allow us to see trade patterns. They allow us to see how things are moving back and forth along the world. But also, of course, there were lots of aromatics and spices and medicinal herbs. For example, rosemary comes into Italy at this point in time, that were becoming more and more available at the same time that public as well as court pharmacies were becoming more known. So I'm showing you a 15th century painting of a pharmacy that's in an illustrated medical treatise that was commissioned by a Jewish merchant for a Catholic convent, which shows a pharmacy with ceramic jars, and a 16th century Turkish painting also with ceramic jars. And in fact, the blending between sort of the spread of these pharmaceuticals and the spread of ceramics is very, very tight because you needed jars to keep things in. I suspect that some of the jars that we're looking at in the Turkish painting are in fact Chinese, by the way. And they developed certain shapes specifically for pharmacies and to hold items. So one of those shapes, which is known as a pharmacy jar or an alburello in Italian, was probably first found in the Islamic world, then ported to Spain, and then transported from Spain to Italy. And if you look at this 15th century Spanish piece and this 15th century Italian piece, you can see that they're both painted with ivory. And ivy was a medicinal herb at this point in time. Should also notice that the Spanish piece uses luster, whereas the Italian piece does not, because they have not gotten to it yet in Italy. And interestingly enough, and just to show you how ubiquitous this all was, this pharmacy jar shape, which probably developed because the sort of indentation in the middle made it easier to pick up and dispense from, became sort of an icon in religious imagery as well. So this is a famous 15th century altarpiece. It's called the Portinari altarpiece. It was commissioned by a merchant for a church in Florence. And if you look at a detail of it, you can see again that we've got our pharmacy jar, exactly the same pharmacy jar with the ivy, as well as a related piece of glass holding flowers that are symbolic of the story, which is the visitation of the shepherds to the newly born Christ child. And this is the reason why, even in Spanish and Italian pharmacies today, you will still find lots of ceramic pots. This is actually the pharmacy at Santa Maria Novella in Florence, which bills itself as the earliest Italian pharmacy in the world, which has wonderful body lotions and which is still using ceramic pots, and is the church for which the Portinari altarpiece was painted. Okay, so that's our second byway. Now for our epilogue, and I am taking you back to China. So the other thing that develops, and I would argue again that it comes from the taste for white that emerged in the late 6th century, is the addition of cobalt blue to the palette of Chinese ceramics. And you find it first in sancai, so first in the 3-color glazes, which become the 4-color glazes. You also find it used as a glaze, and you find it used as a pigment. And obviously, once you've got a white surface, it's very, very easy to use that surface as a canvas or a palette and to put lots of colors on it. So blue and white, which is the sort of late 15th and 16th century global ceramic story that we're not going to get to, emerges in China, late 8th, early 9th century, is immediately copied in the Islamic world, again as a result of the development of this tin glazing, which was a response to imported Chinese ceramics. And the use of cobalt continues in the Islamic world and in European ceramics, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th century, and then begins to flourish in the 15th century. The missing piece is what happens in China, because we definitely have blue and white in the late Tang, and it disappears until the 14th century in the Yuan, and then it takes over the entire Chinese ceramic industry in the 15th and 16th centuries. But why there's no evidence for blue and white in China from the 10th to the 14th century is a problem that occupies my mind all the time. So thank you very much for your attention.